kingdom of heaven. So parables in Matthew, more explicitly than any of the other Gospels, are named as parables of the kingdom. And Ulrich Lutz, in his commentary, you've got far enough through this course now to know about what a good commentary is on Matthew. Ulrich Lutz, in his commentary, as is his way, has a really wonderful excursus on the history of the interpretation of Matthean parables. So if you want to kind of track that down, you can kind of go off and read that. And Lutz argues that there are three particular themes that the parables in Matthew seem to take on. Okay? And really they're summaries of something that I've just already said. The three themes are: the parables are used to reinforce Matthew's conviction that the reign or the rule of God, the kingdom of heaven, is a future eschatological reality. Okay? So it lies in the future and is fundamentally to do with God's saving action, the hope of God's saving action to vindicate God's people. The second theme then is the notion that this future eschatological scenario or promise has what Lutz helpfully calls a double aspect. And the double aspect is it should be understood both positively and negatively. So the positive aspect is that the future promise of God's eschatological salvation offers salvation and life to those who enter the kingdom of God, to those who receive the kingdom of God, to those who are prepared for the future event, to pick up the imagery of Matthew's later parables, to those who have looked after the least of their brothers and sisters when they were in prison, or they were hungry, or they were thirsty, etc., etc., etc. So life and salvation are promised, but the double aspect means that Matthew also is concerned to emphasize the notion of judgment and death. Okay? And the parables, many of the parables, speak of this double aspect at the same time. Just while we're on that topic, of course, one of the major interpretive issues then is if you imagine the Matthean parables as kind of painting a picture of this great eschatological judgment scene, that the question for interpretation is, what do we think Matthew is placing at the foreground of the picture, and what constitutes the background? Okay? And of course, in much of church tradition, what's come to the foreground has been the negative aspect of that judgment scene. The notion that the last judgment will be a place of condemnation for all those who are wicked, those who are sinners, or slightly more cynically, those with whom we disagree about a number of different things. Right? The last judgment comes as punishment for them. And isn't it great that we're all going to heaven? That's kind of the metaphor. Lutz would certainly argue, but he writes as a German Protestant, so understandably I think, but I think this is probably true, that Matthew tells his parable narratives in ways that make it perfectly clear that what's at the foreground is the promise of life and salvation, which takes on meaning and significance by virtue of the fact that it's narrated, the story is told against the backdrop of the consequences if you do not receive the kingdom, if you do not enter the kingdom. This makes Matthew's parables, insofar as they reflect this scenario, parables that quite clearly have strong connections with traditions of Jewish apocalyptic eschatology, for those of you for whom that phrase makes any sense. The notion of a last judgment, of the division of humanity between Israel and the nations is the standard Jewish model, but sheep and the goats, whatever way you want to parse the dualism there. There are different ways of thinking about it. The kingdom is a future reality, this future event, with a double aspect. But the third point is crucial. The parables of the kingdom all are designed to confront the audience in the present with a decision. In other words, they are not merely descriptive of something that will happen. They are meant to be persuasive of the audience to determine the course of their own lives and outlook. So they constitute a call to discipleship. I think that's the way that I would phrase it in relation to Matthew's wider themes. Matthew uses parables to constitute a call to discipleship in the present, in the light of an understanding of the future. Okay, just one more point about parable interpretation more generally, and it's to do with really the history of scholarship on parables and the way in which that scholarship has developed and the interpretation of parables has developed over the years. Scholars have generally agreed that the reason that the synoptic traditions are that they make extensive use of parabolic material is quite clearly to do with the fact that speaking in parables was a characteristic mark of Jesus' own speech and teaching and proclamation. So the reason why there are lots of parables, even when the stories aren't entirely clear, the meaning of them isn't entirely clear, is simply to do with the fact that Jesus spoke in parables. And from that basic observation, we can go off into all sorts of very interesting directions to look, for example, at the way in which other Jewish teachers made use of parables or equivalent story parables, both in the Old Testament. Think of the prophet Nathan's parable to David, King David. Samuel. Who gave it?
No, David, because he's talking
That's
about
right.
the wife and
Bathsheba.
yeah, that's it.
That's the
yeah.
one. So there's an example of a prophetic use of a parable tradition. If we go later than the New Testament, there's lots of rabbinic material about rabbis making use of parables and stories in similar kinds of ways. So that's the first point. The notion of parabolic speaking goes back to Jesus. The second point is that the parables that we have in the New Testament are there because, irrespective of whether Jesus said them in quite the way that they're documented, the church found these parables to be continually useful. In other words, we must allow for the possibility that Jesus said a lot of parables and they didn't make their way into the synoptic tradition. In fact, no one remembered them. Okay? The ones that were remembered and that were told and retold and eventually collated and written down, that process took place because the church found in these stories or these sayings material relevant to their own life, their own sense of discipleship, etc., 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 and particularly maybe the challenges that they face. Which suggests that a good reading of the Matthean parables will be informed by our understanding of the Matthean community. Dorothy used that phrase, I'm sure, hope she has. Matthew's community. Yeah. The community or church for which Matthew was writing. Yeah. You've probably got the sense that scholars disagree massively about what that community was and what kinds of problems it was facing and what kinds of challenges it was in the midst of. So the question of what the connections are between the parables and Matthew's community is up for grabs, I think. But the basic point is we should read Matthew's stories with some kind of connection to our understanding of the community for which Matthew was writing. And it's this notion that the parables were transmitted in Christian tradition that opens up this possibility that the parables may have undergone some change, perhaps